Thank you, Mr. President. I rise to speak this afternoon about the nomination of Betsy DeVos to be Secretary of Education. And I know we'll have some time later today and even tonight, but I wanted to review some of the concerns that I have about her nomination in the allotted time that I'll have, I guess about 15 minutes. Mr. President, the first concern I have is a broad concern that I think is shared by a number of senators on the Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee. The ranking member, Senator Murray, is here with us on the floor, and I'm grateful for her leadership on this nomination debate as well as many other issues. But I guess the broad concern I have is Betsy DeVos's commitment to public education. I come from a state where we have had a tradition of public education since about the 1830s. I'm fairly certain, but I'll stand corrected, but Pennsylvania might have been the first state to have public education as far back as the 1830s. So it's part of the bedrock or the foundation of our state. And still today, 92% of Pennsylvania students attend a traditional public school. We have charter schools. We have roughly 175 or so. But all of those charter schools in Pennsylvania have to be, by statute, have to be public nonprofit entities. So public charter schools are what we have in Pennsylvania. We don't have for-profit private sector charter schools. It's just not allowed by law. There are some limited circumstances when one entity could affiliate with a for-profit entity, but we have nothing like Mrs. DeVos has supported in Michigan and across the country. So for a senator from Pennsylvania to be questioning a nominee for Secretary of Education about for-profit schools, for-profit charter schools, is unusual because we don't have that entity in Pennsylvania. So my concern is substantial, and I'll develop this later, about her commitment to public education. In fact, in my meeting with Mrs. DeVos, because of my concerns, I said something very simple, but I said it for a reason, to remind her about her obligation if she were to be confirmed. I said, you will not be the Secretary of Private Education. You're going to be the Secretary of Education, and for most of the country that means traditional public schools, and I hope that you understand that. So that's a broad concern that I have, and I'll talk more about it. But my line of questioning the day of our hearing, or I should say the evening of our hearing, focused on campus sexual assault. And that, of course, is an area of urgent concern for a lot of people here, a lot of members of the United States Senate, but it's also, of course, of greater concern now because of her nomination. And what do I mean by that? Well, let me just walk through how I got to my questions with her. We know that the Department of Justice tells us that college women are twice as likely to be sexually assaulted than to be robbed in the time that they were in college. And this is a number that comes from the Centers for Disease Control. We also know that 1 in 5 college students experience attempted or completed sexual assault while they are in college. So this is a direct threat to young women all across the country. And I think we've only begun as a country, as a nation, I should say, to begin to take steps to combat sexual assault, to insist that colleges and universities do more, to insist that everyone in the education field, every person on a college campus, assumes some level of responsibility. One of the reasons we can start down that path and begin to be certain that we're at least beginning to wrestle with this problem and give young women on our campuses more protection is because of recent legislation. And we're not done. We've got a lot more to do. But I'll just highlight one bill that I led the fight on, the Campus Sexual Violence Elimination Act, known by its shorter acronym Campus SAVE. That became law back in 2013 when we were reauthorizing, a fancy Washington word for doing it again or improving law, when we were reauthorizing the Violence Against Women Act. And I was glad that we were able to take a substantial step to tackle this horrific problem of sexual assault on campus. That legislation was followed by regulations, and if I could summarize them, that law and the regulations that followed made sure that colleges and universities have clear guidelines, that victims know what their rights are, victims know where to turn in the event of an assault, that we do a lot more on the prevention, that bystanders can no longer be inactive, they have to be trained and prepared to help, and that the entire college campus is focused on preventing sexual assault and then making sure in the aftermath of an assault to deal with it appropriately. This legislation has helped campus communities respond to not only sexual assault, but domestic assault, dating violence, as well as stalking. And it does give students and employees the opportunity to do more than has been done on college campuses. When I was questioning Mrs. DeVos, I asked her if she would commit to upholding Title IX, the non-discrimination statute that includes important protections against sexual assault. I asked her very specifically about the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights, which had issued guidance back in 2011 that advises institutions of higher education to use the so-called preponderance of the evidence standard for campus conduct proceedings. Some may be familiar with that standard. It's a standard that we've used in our jurisprudence for civil cases across the country. So you don't have to prove, nor should a victim of sexual assault on campus have to prove by a higher standard, say clear and convincing is a higher standard, or beyond a reasonable doubt is a criminal standard. What the Department of Education said to the campuses across the country, the universities across the country, is the standard you should use is preponderance of the evidence. And they base that determination after consulting with experts and advocates across the country. So that was the state of the law, and is the state of the law, I should say, currently. The guidance from the Department of Education about that evidentiary standard, my legislation, Campus SAVE, and that's where we are now. So I simply asked Mrs. DeVos whether or not she would commit to enforcing current law and abiding by the 2011 Department of Education guidance. Her response was that it would be premature, I'm using her word, premature, to make that kind of commitment. I was stunned by that answer. Why would it be premature to say you're going to enforce current law? Why would it be premature to say that you can't make a commitment to insisting upon an evidentiary standard that is in place right now? That made no sense to me, and I don't think it made any sense to people across the country who've been working on this problem and trying to get the attention of the Senate and the House and any administration for years, if not for decades. We finally had arrived at a place where we're finally arrived at a place where we're, at long last, dealing with sexual assault in a very aggressive, inappropriate, and fair manner. And now we have a nominee who says that she's not sure whether she can commit to that. So that gave me great pause and is one of the reasons that I don't support her nomination, but I have several reasons. And I know I'm running low on time, but I'll wrap up this portion in a moment. Another area of concern is the answers to questions she gave with regard to specific questions about students with disabilities. This was a set of questions asked by a number of senators, but I'll try to summarize it this way. She seemed to have both a lack of knowledge an apparent and I think obvious lack of knowledge about basic federal law. A law that was passed decades ago, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. She didn't seem to know that that was a federal statute. She seemed to assert that somehow states could decide whether or not to enforce the policy that undergirded that federal law. That, of course, is not the case. It's federal law, and we have to make sure that individuals, in this case students, with disabilities get the rights that they are accorded by virtue of that law. So her lack of knowledge in this area was of concern, but maybe even greater was a lack of, or a seeming lack, in my judgment, of determination to once again enforce this law, to make sure that on her watch, that law that would protect students with disabilities would be enforced to the full extent of the law and nothing less. She didn't seem to be willing to commit to that, or didn't seem to have the kind of commitment that I would expect from a Secretary of Education. What we would all expect, Democrat and Republican, I would hope, is a Secretary of Education who's a champion for public schools, is a champion for those children in public schools, will fight battles and urge states to make the investments in public education, would urge the Congress to make investments in public education, in early learning, and all of the concerns that we have about lack of funding in public education. I would hope that both parties would want a Secretary of Education who is a champion for students with disabilities, who would be a champion for those who are victims of sexual assault on our college campuses. But unfortunately, because of a series of questions both posed at the hearing and questions that were submitted for the record, written questions to which Mrs. DeVos gave written answers, I see that basic commitment lacking. And for that and many reasons which we'll develop a little later tonight, I'll be voting no on her confirmation vote. So, Mr. President, I appreciate this opportunity to share some of my thoughts and hope to be back later this evening. I would yield the floor and note the absence of a quorum.